The winter of 1941 on the Eastern Front was not just cold, it was merciless. Snow buried the land like a vast, white graveyard, swallowing forests, roads, and even the memory of what life was before the war. Lieutenant Adrian Volkov tightened his worn coat, his gaze fixed on the edge of a shattered village just outside what was once a peaceable settlement, now resembled a skeleton burnt houses, broken walls, and a silence that screamed louder than any explosion. Adrian was only 27, but his eyes held the weight of 3 lifetimes. War had stripped so much from him: friends, innocence, sleep, and if feared it might soon take his hope. "Sir, the temperature will drop to -40 tonight, Sergeant Mikhail." Orlov's voice cut through the stillness, his breath turning to smoke in the biting air. Adrian exhaled slowly. "The enemy won't care if we freeze. We hold the North Bridge. No retreat." The order was heavy, a stone in the pit of his stomach. But it was necessary. The German army was advancing relentlessly, and that bridge was the only choke point to stop their tanks from pushing deeper into Soviet land. Mikhail nodded, but a flicker of fear betrayed the resolve in his eyes. The men were exhausted. Ammunition was scarce. Their boots were falling apart. And the cold was an enemy all its own, silent and unyielding. That night, the surviving soldiers huddled together in a broken-down shelter. A small, crackling fire in the center did little to warm their frozen bodies, but it cast a fragile light on their faces, a small spark of humanity in the darkness. A young soldier named Nikolai, barely a man, pulled out a harmonica. His fingers trembled from the frost, yet he managed to play a soft, haunting melody. It was a tune of nostalgia, of a life almost forgotten, and for a moment it felt like hope. The men listened in complete silence. Adrian stared into the flames, his mind drifting to a time before the chaos: his mother singing lullabies, his father meticulously fixing clock gears, the comforting smell of home-baked bread. Mikhail whispered beside him, "Do you think we'll see home again?" Adrian didn't answer right away. He let the final note of the harmonica fade into the wind before saying quietly, "Tomorrow we survive. That's enough of a promise for now." The attack began before dawn, under a sky still bruised with night. The frozen ground trembled as the roar of engines grew from a distant rumble to a deafening thunder. Snow erupted into clouds of dust as bullets rained down from the sky. "Positions!" Adrian's voice tore through the air. Men scrambled to their defensive lines, their movements stiff with cold and fear. The first wave of German tanks emerged from the morning fog like great steel beasts. Machine guns opened up, their staccato rhythm a death drum on the frozen earth. Explosions cracked the ground, sending shards of ice and dirt flying. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, hot metal, and burning wood. Mikhail launched a grenade. Toward an advancing vehicle, a deafening boom followed, shoving the tank sideways as flames began to consume its rear. But for every one they destroyed, another took its place. "Left trenches, now," Adrian commanded, his voice rough. Nikolai flinched as a shell landed terrifyingly close, the impact knocking his harmonica from his grasp and sending it flying into the snow. Mikhail grabbed him, shouting over the din, "Move!" Adrian fired round after round, his ears ringing, his vision shaking, but His men followed him. They trusted him, and that trust made every decision feel heavier than the rifle in his hands. In the heart of the chaos, a moment of pure terror. Nikolai froze his eyes wide as a tank turret swiveled and aimed directly at their line. Time seemed to slow. Adrian didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the young soldier, a single word roaring from his lungs. "Get down!" A blinding blast erupted, swallowing the world in a wall of fire and snow. When the smoke cleared, Adrian was on the ground, a searing pain burning through his shoulder. He pushed himself up, his ears humming a low, painful frequency. He turned. Nikolai was gone. Where the young musician had stood, there was only a deep, dark crater. Snowflakes were already beginning to fall into it, gently, like a final burial shroud. "No," Adrian whispered, his gloved fists trembling with a rage that had no target. Mikhail reached him, breathless and frantic. "We have to move." But Adrian couldn't. Not for a moment. He looked up at the sky gray, endless, utterly unmoved by the tragedy below. The war had no mercy for music, or for the boys who played it. The hours that followed bled into a nightmarish blur of carnage. The Soviets were outnumbered and running dangerously low on supplies, but they refused to break. The radio crackled with static-less reports. Reinforcements were delayed. The bridge had to hold at any cost. Adrian gathered his remaining soldiers, their faces gaunt and smeared with soot. "We are not machines. We are not numbers," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and grief. "They think this winter will kill us. They think we'll surrender before morning. We will prove them wrong." A wounded soldier coughed up blood but still managed a firm nod. Mikhail reloaded his rifle, his knuckles white. For home? The sentiment was echoed by the others. A ragged, defiant chorus for home. As the sun began to bleed through the clouds of smoke, the Germans launched one final, desperate offensive. This was Italiano. Adrian and his men had laid every trap. They had left mines buried in the snow, fuel explosives wired to a detonator, even artillery scraps rigged to blow. The enemy charged, confident in their numbers. Adrian whispered a silent goodbye to every face he had lost on that frozen patch of hell. Then he pulled the trigger. A massive chain explosion erupted beneath the bridge. Flames towered into the morning sky like terrible wings of destruction. Debris rained down as German tanks and machinery shattered. With a fina, agonizing scream of fracturing steel, the bridge collapsed into the frozen river below, dragging the enemy's advance down with it. The assault was stopped, not because an army was stronger, but because a few tired, freezing, human soldiers refused to give up. When the last echoes of destruction faded, a profound silence fell, and the snow began to settle again. Gentle, quiet. Adrian sat slumped against the remains of a concrete wall, blood drying on his sleeve, smoke curling from the singed fabric of his coat. Mikhail limped toward him, barely able to stand. We did it." Adrian just nodded once, the movement taking all of his remaining strength. "Half of us are gone," Mikhail said, his voice thick with sorrow. Adrian's gaze softened as he looked at the survivors. Half of us lived. Years later, after the war finally ended in 1945, veterans returned home, carrying invisible wounds far deeper than any physical scar. Adrian survived, but pieces of him remained forever on that snowy battlefield. He never became a famous general, never sought medals or glory. But every winter, when the snow fell silently outside his window, he would hear the echoes, the faint melody of a harmonica, the distant thunder of explosions, and the whispered promise of survival that became the price of tomorrow. The world calls it World War II. He simply called it the cost of living, because war is won by nations, but it is paid for by people. And true strength isn't found in guns, but in the courage to keep standing when everything inside of you is begging you to fall. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content that honors the echoes of the past. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.